So welcome to lesson 3, where we'll talk about fuel oxidation. Last video, we talked about ATP, which is the dollar of the biochemical world. And in this video and next video, we'll talk about how to get rich and make lots and lots of ATP, starting with the first step, fuel oxidation. So in this lesson, I'll introduce the concept of fuel oxidation. Then we'll talk about the fuel oxidation of carbohydrates and glucose. Then we'll talk about the fuel oxidation of fats. And then we'll talk about the infamous Krebs cycle. So let's get to it. Recall that there are two steps in making ATP. Fuel oxidation, where we take our fuel and rip out all the electrons, and oxidative phosphorylation, which is step 2, where we take these electrons from fuel oxidation and we react them slowly with oxygen to create ATP. So this video will be focusing on step 1 of this process. This was my illustration of that. We're going to take fuel, which comes in the form of food. We're going to break that down and rip out all their electrons, and that fuel is going to end up as carbon dioxide. This is our anaerobic energy system, and it's going to make a small amount of ATP, but the most important thing is the ripping out of the electrons that we can then feed into step 2. So let's talk about how step 1, fuel oxidation, works. Fuel oxidation, as I've said 20 million times already, is the process of taking our fuel and ripping out their electrons. Now, I might just pause and address what the word oxidation means. In chemistry, we have different types of reactions, and one of those reactions is an oxidation reaction. And very simply, oxidation is when you come and steal an electron from someone else. I want you to think of it like that. So fuel oxidation is we're going to steal some electrons from the fuel. Let's see how that works. Our fuel oxidation strategy. First of all, fuel is essentially a chain of carbons, and this applies for both fatty acids and glucose. So what I've got here is a fatty acid chain, as you can see, a bunch of carbons chained together, and between each of these carbons are these bonds, chemical bonds. Now, if you remember, chemical bonds are made of electrons. Electrons are like the glue that hold together molecules and atoms. And so in the bond between these two atoms are the electrons, and that's what we want to steal and extract for our fuel. Now, this is a fatty acid, but you can think of glucose as essentially the same. It's 6 carbon atoms joined in a hexagon. But either way, we're going to break these bonds and extract the electrons from these bonds. So, we're going to take our fuel, we're going to perform a bunch of chemical reactions that break down the bonds between the carbon atoms, which we call fuel oxidation, and that's going to become carbon dioxide once each of the carbons are liberated. But in the process, we're going to take out all the electrons and rip them out for our own nefarious purposes. Mwahahaha. So that's the strategy. Now, I want to pause and say, how do we hold the electrons? You can't have the electrons floating freely around. They are powerful things and can cause a lot of damage and unwanted reactions. We need a way to safely and carefully hold the electrons. And so what we have are special molecules called coenzymes, electron carriers if you will, that will help us hold these electrons. Let me introduce them to you. I have a blue truck and a pink truck, NAD and FAD. These are the two molecules that will help us to hold electrons. Now when we load up an electron onto the NAD truck, we get NADH. Now you'll see the H here that represents hydrogen, and I just want you to think of hydrogen and electrons as roughly the same thing. If you have a hydrogen there, that represents this thing is carrying 1 electron. Same for FAD, except FAD is a slightly bigger truck and it can hold 2 electrons. And so when FAD picks up electrons, it becomes FADH2. So these electron carrying trucks can pick up an electron, and when they pick up an electron, we give them a little extra hydrogen as well. And so in fuel oxidation, what we're really doing is ripping out electrons and loading them onto our electron trucks. So if we redraw the diagram for our fuel oxidation strategy, we have fuel. We're going to do biochemical reactions that break the fuel down and break down the bonds, which is fuel oxidation. That's going to become carbon dioxide. And in that process, we're going to load up our electron trucks. And so our goal is to load up as many electron trucks as we can as we break the fuel down. So the strategy is to break down fuels into carbon dioxide and in doing so, load up our electron carriers, our trucks, to pass on to the next stage of the energy extracting process. Okay, so now that we're clear on the strategy, let's talk about how carbohydrates, i.e. glucose, is oxidized, and we'll talk about how lipids, or fatty acids, are oxidized. So let's start with glucose oxidation. Glucose oxidation involves two steps. Step 1 is glycolysis, and then step 2, the Krebs cycle. So 2 steps. Now, I'm using glucose oxidation as a general term for carbohydrate oxidation, because at the end of the day, all carbohydrates break down into glucose, and then we burn the glucose. So let's focus on how glucose is oxidized. Glucose oxidation. There are 2 steps, like I said. The first step is glycolysis, and this occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. And the second step is the Krebs cycle, which occurs in the mitochondria of the cell. So let's see how this works. First, we start with glucose. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule arranged in a hexagon, and we're going to break that down into pyruvate. We're going to split this glucose in half, and so we end up with 2 3-carbon molecules, which we call pyruvate. And then we'll take pyruvate and then we'll turn that into acetyl coenzyme A. Acetyl CoA is what I'll be referring to, this important molecule, and that is a 2-carbon molecule. So we take glucose, a 6-carbon molecule, split it in half to make pyruvate, and then transform pyruvate again to make acetyl CoA. And this whole process loads up 2 electron trucks. It loads up 2 NADH, and it also incidentally creates 2 molecules of ATP. Excellent. So that's the first step in glucose oxidation. Glucose to pyruvate to acetyl CoA. Got that? Okay, and now the second step is the Krebs cycle, which occurs in the mitochondria. Here we're going to take the acetyl CoA that we've made in glycolysis, and we're going to do a whole bunch of biochemical magic called the Krebs cycle. Don't worry about it for now. And that's going to take it and transform it into carbon dioxide. So we're going to liberate the final bond between those 2 carbon molecules. And this whole process loads up 3 NADH, so 3 blue electron trucks, 1 FADH2, so 1 purple electron truck, and it's also going to create 1 molecule of ATP. So that's glucose oxidation. Step 1, glycolysis. Step 2, Krebs cycle. So let me illustrate this by drawing it in a vertical way. We start with glucose, we break it down to pyruvate, which is 3 carbons long, and then we break that down into acetyl CoA, which is a 2-carbon long molecule, and this whole process is called glycolysis. Next, we change acetyl CoA, rip out that final bond via the Krebs cycle, and that liberates it into carbon dioxide. And this whole process is going to load up some electron trucks. Now, whilst glucose oxidation does produce a few molecules of ATP, it's only a very tiny amount, and in the grand scheme of things, it is nothing. The most important thing is that we've loaded up our electron trucks, NADH and FADH, and we can pass these trucks on to the next step. So that's glucose oxidation, glycolysis followed by the Krebs cycle. Everyone happy? Good. Because now we're going to talk about fatty acid oxidation. And fatty acid oxidation involves 2 steps as well. The first step is beta oxidation, and the second step is the Krebs cycle. Whoa, step 2 is exactly the same, the Krebs cycle, yes. And in fact, fatty acid oxidation is pretty identical to glucose oxidation. It's a very similar process. So, fatty acid oxidation is very similar to glucose oxidation. Okay, very good. 2 steps. The first step is called beta oxidation and occurs in the mitochondria, not the cytoplasm. And you know what step 2 is. Step 2 is the Krebs cycle, which occurs in the mitochondria. So, why is it called beta oxidation? Well, if you really want to know, it's because the oxidation actually happens to the beta carbon in the fatty acid chain. Don't worry about it. You don't need to know that. Let's just talk about what happens. So we start off with a fatty acid, which is many carbons long. So you can imagine a chain of carbons. And what we're going to do is lop off 2 carbons at a time. And so every time we lop off 2 carbons, we make a molecule of acetyl CoA, which is a 2-carbon bit of the long chain. So we're going to lop off 2 carbons and make one molecule of acetyl-CoA, and then lop off another 2 to make another molecule, and another 2, and we're going to chop this fatty acid up in bits of 2 carbons. That's called beta oxidation. And this process loads up one NAD and one FAD for every molecule of acetyl-CoA. So that's beta oxidation. We're going to take a long chain and chop up 2 carbons at a time. And then you know what happens next. We take the acetyl-CoA, this 2 carbon bits, and we feed it into the Krebs cycle, which is, that's right, a lot of biochemical magic. And that's going to break down the final bond, release the carbon as carbon dioxide, and we're going to load up 3 NADs, 1 FAD, and make 1 molecule of ATP. So that's fatty acid oxidation. Again, very similar to glucose oxidation. I'm going to draw this picture again in vertical format. Fatty acids, we're going to break it down 2 carbons at a time to make lots of acetyl-CoA, which we call beta oxidation. And then finally, we put the acetyl-CoA through the Krebs cycle, which then creates carbon dioxide. And most importantly, we load up our electron trucks, ready for step 2, oxidative phosphorylation. And so that's a summary of how we break down our fuels from either a long fatty acid chain or a molecule of glucose. We break that down to carbon dioxide and we load up our electron trucks in the meantime.
Okay, but what about the Krebs cycle?
Well, let's talk about the Krebs cycle. There will come a day where a student learns the Krebs cycle, and it might be today for you, and then you'll promptly forget about it and never have anything to do with it again. So let's talk about the Krebs cycle so that you too can go through this ritual of learning and forgetting the Krebs cycle. All the acetyl-CoA that is formed from glycolysis and from beta oxidation will enter into this thing which we call the Krebs cycle. Now, the Krebs cycle has 20 million other names. It's also known as the citric acid cycle. It's also known as the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And it's also known as the Cent-Georgi-Krebs cycle, just to name a few of its other names. And essentially, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take acetyl-CoA, which we get from glycolysis and beta oxidation, and we're going to combine that with oxaloacetate to make citrate, or citric acid. That's why it's called the citric acid. This starts off the process. So step 1 is starting the process. Step 2 is where we then take this citric acid and we oxidize it. So we steal its electrons and we'll make succinyl-CoA, which is this molecule here. And then finally, we're going to take succinyl-CoA and regenerate it into oxaloacetate so that it can complete the cycle again and again and again until death. So that's the Krebs cycle, and let's illustrate that. So we start off with acetyl-CoA, which we get a bunch of from glycolysis and beta oxidation, and we're going to put it through the Krebs cycle now. So the first thing we do is react it with this carrier molecule called oxaloacetate. So acetyl-CoA has 2 carbons in it, oxaloacetate has 2 carbons in it, and when we combine them, we get this 4-carbon molecule called citrate, also known as citric acid. And so citrate says, let's go. It's time to start the Krebs cycle. And so it gears up and becomes isocitrate, essentially flips. And isocitrate is where we kick off the first set of processes. So our first oxidation reaction happens, NAD comes along, and it steals an electron. It makes our first molecule of CO2, turns it into alpha ketoglutarate, 3 carbons. And then another electron truck comes along, and another NAD comes along and steals another electron, and we make succinyl-CoA. And so now we have loaded up 2 electron trucks and released 2 molecules of CO2, and we reach succinyl-CoA. And then finally, we've got to regenerate our oxaloacetate. So to get back there, we have a reaction which releases 1 molecule of GTP to make succinate. GTP is essentially analogous to ATP. And then succinate becomes fumarate, loading up 1 FADH2, and then fumarate becomes malate, and then malate finally undergoes 1 final oxidation, loading up 1 NADH to make oxaloacetate. And then we're back here, ready again to react with more acetyl-CoA, and it goes around and around and around. And that's why we call it the Krebs cycle. And the total yield is 3 molecules of NADH, which is worth about 2.5 ATP each, 1 molecule of FADH, and 1 GTP. So you generate about 10 ATP's molecules worth. And so this is the Krebs cycle. Feel free to memorize this and then completely forget it. You see, the important thing is not to know every single step along the way. The important thing is to know the concept behind why we do the Krebs cycle, which is taking some sort of carbon-based molecule, i.e. acetyl-CoA, that we've made from burning our fuel, transforming that into carbon dioxide and loading up all the electrons in that fuel onto our electron trucks. And so that's what the Krebs cycle is about. Let's summarize. So, we talked about fuel oxidation today of glucose and of fatty acids. First of all, glucose is glycolysis, then Krebs cycle. So, glucose becomes pyruvate, which becomes acetyl-CoA, that's glycolysis, and then put that through the Krebs cycle to become carbon dioxide. Fatty acid oxidation is called beta oxidation, where we turn fatty acids into acetyl-CoA and then put that through the Krebs cycle to become carbon dioxide. And most importantly is that both processes load up our electron trucks ready for oxidative phosphorylation. And so that's a summary of all the processes involved in fuel oxidation. Here's a summary in words for all you people who love words and reading, and I'll see you in the next video to see what we do with these electron trucks. See you there.